June 12, 1943. Northern Regional Research Laboratory, Peoria, Illinois. The late afternoon sun cut through the industrial windows in geometric shards, illuminating dust particles that danced above rows of steel fermentation tanks. Andrew Jackson Moyer stood motionless before tank number 7, watching the amber liquid circulate through glass observation ports with the intensity of a man witnessing either his triumph or his ruin. His left hand gripped a clipboard so tightly that his knuckles had bleached white. His right hand held a single glass vial, barely 3 ounces of golden brown fluid that carried within it the mathematical difference between 100,000 American boys coming home and 100,000 mothers receiving folded flags. The tank hummed, a low, mechanical purr that Moyer had learned to interpret like a language. The pitch told him temperature, the rhythm spoke of oxygen flow, the occasional gurgle revealed the secret metabolism of billions of microscopic fungi converting corn-steep liquor into the most valuable substance on Earth. He had not slept more than 4 hours in the past 72. His laboratory coat carried the stains of a dozen failed batches, each one representing weeks of work, thousands of dollars, and the invisible weight of soldiers bleeding out in field hospitals from wounds that should not kill them. Behind him, he heard the careful footsteps of his assistant, Robert Coghill. Neither man spoke. They had moved past words 3 months ago when the War Department liaison had placed actual photographs on Moyer's desk. Not propaganda, not statistics, but images of young men with their faces turned away from the camera, their bandaged limbs dark with the telltale spread of gangrene, their futures measured in hours unless something changed. The liaison had said nothing. He had simply left the photographs there, arranged in a neat row, and walked out. Moyer lifted the vial to the light. Inside, suspended in that amber liquid, were the dissolved dreams of Alexander Fleming, the desperate hopes of Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, and the very specific mathematical problem that had consumed every waking hour of Moyer's existence since Pearl Harbor. How do you take a substance that costs more per ounce than gold, that can only be produced in thimbleful quantities, that spoils within days, and transform it into something you can manufacture by the ton, ship across oceans, and inject into dying boys in the mud of Sicily or the hedgerows of France? The answer circulated in tank number 7. The scale of the problem would have seemed absurd to anyone outside this peculiar intersection of mycology, chemical engineering, and industrial warfare. In 1941, the entire world's supply of penicillin could fit in a shoebox. The British researchers who had proven its miraculous properties, wounds that festered into fatal sepsis were suddenly curable with a few injections, could barely produce enough for a handful of patients. Their method required growing the penicillium mold on the surface of shallow pans filled with nutrient broth, like a vast, temperamental garden of microscopic fungi. It was elegant in theory, catastrophic in practice. The yield was minuscule, the process was slow. And Britain, under bombardment, with its pharmaceutical factories converted to munitions production and its supply lines choked by U-boats, simply could not scale it. So the problem crossed the Atlantic, landing on desks in Washington, then filtering down through bureaucratic channels to research laboratories scattered across the American heartland. To Moyer's lab in Peoria, Illinois, a facility originally dedicated to finding industrial uses for agricultural waste products, corn was abundant. Corn-steep liquor, the thick brown liquid left over from wet milling corn, was essentially free, a waste product that farmers and processors were happy to give away. If someone had told Moyer in 1939 that this malodorous byproduct would become the foundation of the most important medical achievement of the century, He would have politely suggested they check their sanity, but that was before he understood what war did to mathematics. The numbers haunted him. Moyer was not a soldier, had never fired a weapon, would likely never see combat. But he understood statistics with the cold precision of a microbiologist who had spent decades counting colonies on agar plates. And the statistics of battlefield medicine were a horror that no amount of bravery could overcome. In the First World War, a soldier wounded in the abdomen had perhaps a 20% chance of survival. A compound fracture, bone breaking through skin, was nearly always a death sentence, not from the injury itself, but from the infection that followed. Gas gangrene, that terrible anaerobic infection that turned tissue black and filled it with gas bubbles, killed more men than bullets in some theaters. The standard treatment was amputation, and even that often failed. Surgeons learned to recognize the sweet, rotten smell of Clostridium perfringens before they even entered the surgical tent. By 1942, military medicine had advanced in every way except the one that mattered most. Surgeons could operate faster with better technique. Blood transfusions were standardized. Evacuation chains moved wounded men from battlefield to field hospital to base hospital with increasing efficiency. But once infection set in, and it set in often because bullets and shrapnel carried dirt and cloth fragments deep into tissue, the surgeon's options remained medieval. Cut it out, cut it off, or watch the patient die. Sulfa drugs had provided some hope, but they were limited, often ineffective against the full spectrum of battlefield bacteria, and they came with side effects that sometimes rivaled the disease. Penicillin was different. The early reports from Oxford, from the handful of patients who had received it, read like miracle testimony. Infections that should have killed within days simply stopped, disappeared. Wounds that festered began to heal. The drug seemed to target bacteria with almost supernatural precision while leaving human tissue untouched. But in 1941, when the United States entered the war, the total American production of penicillin was approximately 0. Britain could spare perhaps enough for a few dozen patients per month. The projected need, if the Allies were to invade Europe, if they were to fight in North Africa, if they were to island hop across the Pacific, was measured in millions of doses. The gap between what existed and what was needed was not merely large, it was cosmological. And bridging it would require abandoning everything that microbiology had taught about growing molds. Traditional microbiology, as practiced since Louis Pasteur, relied on surface growth. You wanted to grow bacteria or molds. You spread them thin across the surface of a nutrient medium in shallow dishes or flasks exposed to air and waited. The principle was sound. Most of these organisms needed oxygen, and surface growth maximized their access to air. The method worked beautifully for laboratory research, for producing small quantities of experimental material, for winning Nobel Prizes. It was completely unsuitable for industrial warfare. Moyer's heresy was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Grow the mold not on the surface, but throughout the entire volume of liquid. Submerged fermentation. Deep fermentation. It violated every intuition that mycologists had developed over decades. Penicillium was an aerobic organism. It needed oxygen. How could it possibly thrive when submerged in hundreds of gallons of liquid? The answer lay in engineering what nature had never designed. Constant, violent agitation combined with forced aeration. The fermentation tanks in Peoria were essentially giant washing machines for mold. Impellers churned the liquid continuously, breaking it into millions of tiny droplets. Compressed air bubbled up from the bottom, carrying oxygen to every cubic centimeter of the medium. The mold, instead of forming a placid mat on the surface, grew as tiny pellets suspended throughout the liquid, each pellet a microscopic factory producing penicillin at rates that surface growth could never match. But the engineering was only half the problem. The mold needed food, and not just any food. It needed the right balance of carbon, nitrogen, trace minerals, and growth factors to produce maximum penicillin, rather than simply reproducing itself. This was where corn steep liquor became miraculous. The discovery happened by accident, as so many revolutions do. Moyer had been systematically testing nutrient media, everything from yeast extract to peptone to synthetic amino acid mixtures. Each batch cost money, required precise preparation, and yielded maddeningly inconsistent results. The Penicillium notatum strain they were using, the original Fleming strain, was temperamental, producing wildly variable amounts of antibiotic depending on conditions that seemed to shift with the weather. Then someone, and the laboratory notebooks would later dispute exactly who, suggested trying corn steep liquor. It was available in unlimited quantities from the wet milling plants that surrounded Peoria. It cost essentially nothing. And it was rich in exactly the complex mixture of nutrients that Moyer suspected the mold might need. Proteins broken down into peptides and amino acids, B vitamins, trace minerals leached from corn during processing. The first batch using corn steep liquor produced yields 10 times higher than anything they had achieved before. Moyer repeated the experiment. The results held. He modified the concentration, the pH, the aeration rate. Each iteration improved the yield further. Within 6 months, they were producing penicillin at concentrations that made the British surface culture method look like a child's chemistry set. But even this was not enough. The strain itself remained a problem. Penicillium notatum, for all its fame as Fleming's original discovery, was not particularly enthusiastic about producing penicillin. It preferred to spend its metabolic energy on reproduction rather than antibiotic synthesis. What Moyer needed was a different strain, one that had evolved or been selected for high production. The search became almost comical in its desperation. Laboratory assistants scoured Peoria for moldy produce, scraping samples from rotting fruit, spoiled bread, decomposing vegetables. Each sample was cultured, tested, evaluated. Hundreds of strains proved useless. Some produced no penicillin at all. Others grew too slowly or required impossible conditions. Then, in the summer of 1943, a laboratory assistant named Mary Hunt brought in a cantaloupe she had purchased at a local market. The fruit was thoroughly rotted, covered in a golden green mold that spread across its surface like a particularly aggressive colony. The mold was Penicillium chrysogenum, a different species entirely from Fleming's notatum. When cultured in Moyer's deep fermentation tanks with corn steep liquor as the medium, it produced penicillin at rates that seemed almost impossible. 250 units per milliliter, then 500, then 1,000 as the strain was further selected and optimized. The cantaloupe that saved the world. That was how laboratory folklore would remember it, though the reality was more complex. The Peoria strain, as it came to be known, was further improved through ultraviolet radiation, X-ray mutagenesis, and ruthless selection. Each generation was tested, the highest producers were isolated, and the process repeated. By late 1943, they had a strain producing 2,000 units per milliliter, roughly 1,000 times more concentrated than the original British surface cultures. Now the mathematics shifted from impossible to merely staggering. The transition from laboratory to factory floor was orchestrated with a speed that peacetime capitalism could never have achieved. The War Production Board classified penicillin production as a national priority, equivalent to the Manhattan Project in urgency, if not in secrecy. Pharmaceutical companies that had previously competed were ordered to share research, pool resources, collaborate on production techniques. Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, companies that would later become household names, converted brewery equipment, milk processing tanks, anything that could be sterilized and aerated, into penicillin fermenters. By early 1944, production facilities stretched across the industrial Northeast and Midwest. The fermentation tanks grew larger, 1,000 gallons, 5,000 gallons, 10,000 gallons of corn-steep liquor churning with Penicillium chrysogenum, each tank monitored around the clock by technicians who checked pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen, and glucose concentration with a vigilance usually reserved for nuclear reactors. The extraction and purification process was equally challenging. Penicillin in the fermentation broth was like gold in ore, valuable, but mixed with thousands of other compounds. The mold produced proteins, carbohydrates, pigments, other metabolites. All of these had to be removed to leave pure crystalline penicillin. The process involved acidification to make the penicillin soluble in organic solvents, extraction with amyl acetate, back extraction into aqueous solution, precipitation, filtration, drying. A chemical ballet performed on an industrial scale with margins of error measured in hours because penicillin degraded rapidly if not stabilized. By May 1944, on the eve of D-Day, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 2.3 million doses of penicillin per month. By the time of the Normandy invasion on June 6th, every Allied soldier going ashore carried a syrette, a single-use tube like a toothpaste container filled with 100,000 units of penicillin. Medics carried dozens more. Field hospitals were stocked with vials containing millions of units. The Allied Medical Corps had been transformed from a triage operation focused on keeping men alive long enough to ship them home, into an aggressive treatment force that could save men with wounds that would have been automatically fatal just 3 years earlier. Chest wounds, abdominal perforations, compound fractures with massive tissue damage. All now had survival rates that would have seemed miraculous in the First World War. The Germans noticed. July 19th, 1944. Field Hospital Complex, Normandy hedgerow country, German-occupied France. Oberstarzt. Heinrich Weber moved between the cots with the exhausted precision of a surgeon who had long ago exceeded his capacity for horror. The converted barn stank of gangrene, disinfectant, and that peculiar sweet rotten smell that indicated advanced infection. Every man on every cot was dying, though at different speeds. The mathematics of battlefield medicine in the Wehrmacht had become unsustainable. Weber had trained in the best surgical techniques that German medicine could provide. He had studied under professors who were legends in their field. He could remove shrapnel, repair damaged vessels, reconstruct shattered bone with a skill that would have served him well in civilian practice. But none of his training had prepared him for the central truth of combat surgery in 1944. Technical skill meant nothing when infection killed faster than evacuation could save. Sulfonamides helped. Sometimes. They reduced the bacterial load in wounds, occasionally prevented sepsis from developing. But they were unreliable against many of the worst battlefield pathogens. Gas gangrene laughed at sulfa drugs. Staphylococcal infections often shrugged them off. And the side effects, kidney damage, blood disorders, meant that Weber had to calculate whether the treatment might kill the patient faster than the infection. What haunted him was the intelligence reports. Captured American medical supplies included ampules labeled with an unfamiliar word, penicillin. The instructions indicated dosing schedules of 100,000 units every 3 to 4 hours for severe infections. The reported efficacy was so high that Weber's first assumption was propaganda. American psychological warfare designed to demoralize German medical personnel. Then he saw the evidence. Not reports, not statistics, but actual patients. American prisoners of war, wounded during the fighting in the hedgerows, captured before they could be evacuated to their own medical units. Men with injuries that should have killed them within days, who instead showed healthy granulation tissue, normal temperatures, wounds that were healing rather than festering. When questioned, they described receiving injections from medics immediately after being wounded, additional doses during evacuation, continuous treatment at field hospitals. The Americans were fighting a different war, a war where infection was an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. August 4th, 1944. Near Saint-Lô, France. Lieutenant James Kellerman, 29th Infantry Division, United States Army, had precisely 17 minutes of combat experience when the mortar round impacted 3 meters to his left. The explosion was less a sound than a physical force that picked him up and threw him sideways into the hedgerow. He did not remember hitting the ground. He remembered the silence that followed the explosion, a cottony deadness in his ears, and then the slow realization that his left leg was no longer connected to his body in any meaningful sense. The femur had shattered. Bone fragments protruded through his torn trouser leg. Blood pulsed with each heartbeat, arterial bleeding, the kind that killed you in minutes if untreated. His training took over before conscious thought did. Tourniquet above the wound. Tighten until the bleeding stops. Morphine syrette from his first aid kit, jab it into his thigh, squeeze the tube. The world acquired soft edges. His squad medic appeared, Private Hernandez, a former pharmacy student from Chicago who moved with practiced efficiency. Hernandez ignored Kellerman's attempts to speak, ignored everything except the leg. Pressure dressing. Another morphine syrette, and then something Kellerman had heard about but never seen. Hernandez pulled a small tube from his medical kit, twisted off the cap, and jabbed the needle through Kellerman's uniform into his upper thigh, squeezing the contents into his muscle. "Penicillin," Hernandez said, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "You're going to be fine, Lieutenant." Kellerman did not believe him. The pain, even through the morphine, was transcendent. He could feel his leg lying at an impossible angle, could sense the grinding of bone fragments, could taste copper in his mouth from where he had bitten through his lip. Men did not survive wounds like this. Not in the stories his father told about the First World War. Not in any reasonable universe. The evacuation chain moved him like a package through a complex postal system. Litter bearers carried him back through the hedgerows to a battalion aid station, where a surgeon spent 90 seconds evaluating the wound before scribbling on a tag and waving him toward an ambulance. The ambulance, a converted truck that bounced over cratered roads, took him to a field hospital 2 miles behind the lines. More penicillin. Plasma transfusion, X-rays, surgery to remove the most dangerous bone fragments and repair the femoral artery. He woke in a clean bed, in a tent that smelled of canvas and disinfectant rather than blood and cordite. His leg was immobilized in a cast, elevated, attached to some kind of traction apparatus. A nurse, an actual nurse in a clean uniform, was checking his pulse. What? How long? His voice was a croak. 18 hours since you were wounded, she said. You're going to keep the leg. Doctor says another week of observation here, then evacuation to England for orthopedic reconstruction. Going to keep the leg. In his father's war, that sentence would have been unthinkable. Compound femur fracture? Amputation was the only option, and even that often failed. But this was not his father's war. The Germans captured Kellerman 3 days later when their counterattack overran the field hospital. He was barely conscious from the latest round of morphine when Wehrmacht soldiers entered the tent, weapons ready, expecting resistance. They found only wounded men in beds and medical staff with their hands raised. What followed violated every propaganda narrative that both sides had constructed about the other. The German soldiers, combat-worn and exhausted, did not shoot the wounded. They did not bayonet the helpless. They simply processed them. Tags were checked, a German medical officer made quick evaluations, and the patients were left in their beds under guard. Oberstarzt Weber arrived the next morning. He moved through the captured American facility with the careful attention of a man conducting an autopsy on his own failures. The surgical equipment was superior to what the Wehrmacht possessed, more of it better maintained, supported by supply lines that seemed almost miraculous in their abundance. The pharmaceutical stores were impossible. Morphine measured in hundreds of doses rather than dozens carefully hoarded, sulfa drugs in quantities that German field hospitals could only dream about, and rows of small glass ampules labeled penicillin, 100,000 units. Weber had one ampule analyzed by a Wehrmacht laboratory. The report confirmed what he had suspected. This was the miracle drug that appeared in Allied medical journals but remained unavailable to German forces. The British had invented it, but lacked production capacity. The Americans had somehow manufactured it in quantities that allowed routine use for every wounded soldier. He stood over Kellerman's bed, reviewing the chart that the American medical staff had maintained. Compound femur fracture, arterial bleeding, massive tissue damage. Penicillin administered in the field within 20 minutes of injury. Additional doses every 4 hours during evacuation and treatment. No sign of infection. The wound was healing. In Weber's experience, this patient should be dead or dying from gas gangrene. Instead, his temperature was normal, his wound showed healthy granulation, and he would likely survive with a functional leg. Wo bekommen Sie dieses Medikament? Weber asked in careful English. Where do you get this medicine? Kellerman, foggy with morphine and pain but recognizing the question, gave the only answer he knew. It's standard issue. Every medic carries it. Every medic. Standard issue. The implications were staggering. The Americans had industrialized a medical miracle. While German pharmaceutical companies struggled to produce adequate quantities of sulfa drugs, the Americans were issuing penicillin to individual soldiers like ammunition. Weber's report to his superiors was clinical, precise, and damning. The Americans possessed a decisive medical advantage that translated directly into combat effectiveness. German soldiers knew that severe wounds likely meant death from infection, even if they survived initial treatment. American soldiers knew they had a reasonable chance of survival, even with catastrophic injuries. This knowledge affected morale, tactical decisions, the willingness to take risks. But beyond psychology lay mathematics. Every German soldier killed or permanently disabled by infection was a soldier who could not return to combat. Every American soldier saved by penicillin was a soldier who might, after months of recovery and rehabilitation, return to duty. Over time, this differential accumulated into a strategic advantage as significant as superior tanks or aircraft. The German pharmaceutical industry attempted to respond. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced everything from aspirin to Zyklon B, devoted resources to developing penicillin production capacity. But they faced insurmountable obstacles. The deep fermentation technique required industrial infrastructure that Germany, under constant Allied bombing, could not maintain. The penicillium strains available to German researchers were inferior to the American varieties developed in Peoria. Most critically, Germany lacked the agricultural abundance that made corn-steep liquor available in unlimited quantities. By late 1944, German military hospitals were treating American prisoners with captured American penicillin because it was more effective than anything in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. The irony was lost on no one. German surgeons watched American soldiers survive wounds that killed German soldiers, treated with medicine manufactured in American factories, derived from techniques developed in American laboratories, based on a discovery made in Britain. The true scale of penicillin's impact would not be calculated until after the war, when medical statisticians could compare mortality rates across conflicts. The numbers told a story more dramatic than any propaganda could construct. In the First World War, 13.4% of wounded American soldiers died from their injuries or subsequent infections. In the Second World War, that figure dropped to 4.5%. The difference, nearly 9 percentage points, represented approximately 150,000 American lives saved. Not all of this improvement could be attributed to penicillin. Blood transfusions, faster evacuation, better surgical technique all contributed. But epidemiological studies suggested that penicillin alone prevented between 100,000 and 200,000 deaths among Allied forces. 100,000 to 200,000. The number was almost too large to comprehend. It represented cities' worth of young men who would return home, who would marry, have children, build careers, grow old. The demographic impact alone was staggering. A generation that did not disappear into military cemeteries. Lieutenant Kellerman was one data point in this vast statistical salvation. He spent 6 weeks in German captivity, during which Wehrmacht surgeons, using captured American penicillin, continued his treatment. The bitter absurdity of the situation was not lost on him. He was receiving better medical care as a German prisoner than German soldiers were receiving in their own hospitals. When Allied forces overran his prison camp in March 1945, he was evacuated first to England, then to a military hospital in Virginia. The orthopedic surgeons there performed 3 additional operations over 18 months, rebuilding the shattered femur with bone grafts and steel pins. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But he walked. He returned to his family's hardware store in Pennsylvania, married, had 4 children, and died in 1998 at the age of 76, having lived 54 years that should not have existed. He was never a hero. His 17 minutes of combat experience did not include any acts of valor. He fired his weapon once at no visible target before the mortar round ended his war. But he was alive because a microbiologist in Peoria, Illinois, had solved the problem of growing mold in corn-steep liquor, and because American industry had converted that solution into millions of ampules of golden liquid that medics carried onto beaches and into hedgerows and up mountain passes. Andrew Jackson Moyer never visited a battlefield. He never saw the field hospitals where his work saved lives. He remained in Peoria throughout the war, obsessively refining fermentation techniques, optimizing yields, solving the endless cascade of production problems that arose when scaling from laboratory flasks to 10,000-gallon industrial tanks. He was not a modest man, but neither was he self-promoting. He published his findings in scientific journals with careful attention to detail and methodology. He answered questions from pharmaceutical company engineers who were implementing his techniques. He corresponded with British researchers who wanted to understand how the Americans had achieved such dramatic improvements in production. What he did not do was seek public recognition. While generals received medals and war correspondents wrote purple prose about battlefield heroism, Moyer continued working in his laboratory because the war was not over and production could always be improved, and every percentage point increase in yield meant more ampules for more medics, for more soldiers. The scientific community recognized his contributions. In 1945, he received the Mead-Johnson Award for Research in Nutrition. In 1948, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. But these were honors within his professional sphere, meaningless to the general public. The soldiers who survived because of his work did not know his name. The families who got their sons back did not send him letters of gratitude because they did not know he existed. This was the nature of his contribution. It was infrastructure, not drama. It was process engineering, not battlefield heroics. It was the kind of achievement that modern industrial civilization depends upon but rarely celebrates. The conversion of scientific discovery into practical application on a scale sufficient to matter. Fleming discovered penicillin. Florey and Chain proved it worked in humans, but Moyer made it available. He bridged the gap between laboratory miracle and mass production. He solved the problem that no one else had solved: how to manufacture a complex biological product with consistent quality in quantities sufficient for total war. Weber survived the war and returned to civilian practice in Hamburg. His surgical skills, honed under the worst possible conditions, made him an excellent peacetime physician. But he never forgot the captured American field hospital, the rows of penicillin ampules, the wounded soldier with the shattered femur who should have died but lived. In his later years, he gave occasional interviews to medical historians studying wartime medicine. He was asked repeatedly whether better medical supplies could have changed the outcome of the war. His answer was always nuanced. Penicillin alone could not have overcome Germany's strategic disadvantages: the two-front war, the resource imbalances, the tactical mistakes. But the medical differential had effects beyond mere survival statistics. "We learned not to be wounded," he said in one interview conducted in 1973. "Your soldiers learned they might survive. This changed how men fought. A German soldier with a serious wound knew his chances were poor. An American soldier with the same wound had hope. Hope is a tactical advantage." The German pharmaceutical industry, after the war, rapidly adopted American fermentation techniques. IG Farben was broken up during denazification, but its successor companies became major producers of antibiotics. The knowledge flowed freely. Scientific publications, patent applications, personnel exchanges. By the early 1950s, penicillin production was a global industry, and the techniques developed in Peoria had become standard practice worldwide. But during the crucial years of 1943 to 1945, the imbalance had been absolute. The Allies possessed a decisive medical technology. The Axis did not. And in a war of attrition, where victory depended on the ability to sustain casualties and continue fighting, this difference accumulated into strategic advantage. There is a peculiar irony in the fact that the most important medical breakthrough of the 20th century was enabled by agricultural waste. Moyer had spent years before the war searching for industrial uses for corn byproducts. the milling residues and processing liquids that accumulated in vast quantities around Peoria's grain facilities. The research was unglamorous, barely funded, of interest only to a handful of specialists in applied mycology and fermentation science. Then war transformed waste into treasure. The corn steep liquor that farmers had been discarding or using as animal feed became the nutrient base for penicillin production. The industrial infrastructure built for grain processing was repurposed for antibiotic manufacture. The expertise in large-scale fermentation, developed for brewing and ethanol production, was applied to growing pharmaceutical molds. This was American industrial capacity expressing itself in biological rather than mechanical form. The same logistical genius that produced Liberty ships by the dozen and B-24 bombers by the thousand also produced penicillin by the ton. The same agricultural abundance that fed Allied armies also fed the fermentation tanks that produced their medicine. The same pragmatic engineering culture that valued results over elegance solved the problem of scaling up a finicky biological process to industrial volumes. Moyer understood this better than most. His background was not in pure science, but in applied research, finding practical solutions to industrial problems. He had worked for the Department of Agriculture, not a university. His mandate was not to advance theoretical knowledge, but to develop techniques that could be implemented immediately, at scale, with existing equipment. This orientation proved decisive. While academic researchers might have spent years optimizing every parameter, pursuing elegant solutions, Moyer pursued adequate solutions that could be implemented immediately. His fermentation medium was not chemically defined. Corn steep liquor was a complex mixture of unknown compounds, but it worked, it was available, and it was cheap. His fermentation vessels were not custom designed. They were modified brewery tanks and food processing equipment. But they could be built quickly in existing factories. The impact of wartime penicillin production extended far beyond saving soldiers' lives, though that alone would have justified the entire effort. The industrial infrastructure created during the war became the foundation for the modern pharmaceutical industry. The fermentation techniques developed for penicillin were adapted for producing other antibiotics: streptomycin for tuberculosis, chloramphenicol for typhoid, tetracycline for a broad spectrum of infections. The expectation that bacterial infections could be cured rather than endured transformed medicine. Surgeons could attempt operations that would have been unthinkably risky in the pre-antibiotic era. Simple wounds and minor surgeries, which had carried significant risk of fatal infection, became routine procedures. Childbirth became dramatically safer. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, syphilis, diseases that had killed millions, became manageable conditions. This medical revolution happened with remarkable speed. In 1940, a child with bacterial meningitis had perhaps a 2% chance of survival. By 1950, with appropriate antibiotic treatment, survival rates exceeded 80%. In 1 decade, a near certain death sentence became a survivable illness. The demographic effects were equally dramatic. Life expectancy in the United States increased by approximately 8 years between 1940 and 1960. Not all of this improvement was due to antibiotics, but epidemiologists estimate that antibiotics contributed at least 3 to 4 years of that gain. Millions of people who would have died from bacterial infections in the pre-antibiotic era lived decades longer. These were not abstractions. They were individuals. Children who survived scarlet fever, mothers who survived childbirth complications, workers who survived industrial accidents, elderly people who survived pneumonia. Each survival rippled outward in expanding circles of consequence. Children grew up with parents who would have died. Families maintained economic stability that would have been shattered by medical catastrophe. Communities retained members who would have been lost. And it began with a microbiologist in Peoria growing mold in corn-steep liquor. By 1955, penicillin was so common, so routine, so thoroughly integrated into medical practice that its revolutionary nature had already begun to fade from public consciousness. People born after the war had no memory of a world where bacterial infections were death sentences. They took antibiotics for granted in the same way they took clean water and electric light for granted, as background features of modern life rather than recent miracles. Moyer retired from government service in 1958. His contributions were acknowledged within the scientific community. More awards, honorary degrees, respectful citations in review articles and textbooks, but he remained largely unknown outside that specialized sphere. No monuments were erected, no holidays commemorated his work. The soldiers who survived because of penicillin celebrated VE Day and VJ Day, not the day in 1943 when Moyer's fermentation technique first achieved commercial viability. This forgetting was perhaps inevitable. Modern societies celebrate warriors more readily than researchers, battles more easily than breakthroughs in process engineering. The story of penicillin's discovery had narrative appeal. Fleming's accidental observation of mold-killing bacteria, his famous contaminated Petri dish, fit the popular archetype of scientific serendipity. The story of penicillin's production was less cinematically satisfying. Engineers solving differential equations about oxygen transfer rates in viscous fluids, chemists optimizing extraction procedures, microbiologists irradiating fungal spores and selecting for high-yield mutants. Yet the production story mattered more than the discovery story. Fleming's observation was scientifically fascinating, but practically useless until someone solved the manufacturing problem. Thousands of potentially valuable compounds have been discovered in laboratories and remain there, imprisoned by the difficulty of producing them at scale or by economic factors that made production unprofitable. Penicillin escaped that fate because Moyer and his colleagues solved the production problem, and because the U.S. government, facing the prospect of casualty rates that could undermine public support for the war, provided the resources and political pressure necessary to scale up production with wartime urgency. Lieutenant Kellerman met Andrew Moyer exactly once in 1973 at a medical history conference in Washington, where Kellerman was speaking about his experience as a wounded prisoner of war. Someone mentioned that Moyer was in the audience, and after the presentation, Kellerman sought him out. The two men stood in an awkward silence for a moment. Kellerman, now in his early 50s, walked with a pronounced limp, but was otherwise healthy. Managing the hardware store, serving on the school board, living the ordinary, prosperous life of post-war America. Moyer, 78 years old, frail but alert, looked at him with the clinical interest of a scientist evaluating experimental results. "You were wounded in August 1944?" Moyer asked. 4th of August, compound femur fracture. The Peoria strain would have been in full production by then. The dosing protocol had been standardized. "You received injections in the field?" "Within 20 minutes of the injury, then every 4 hours during evacuation and treatment." Moyer nodded slowly. That was the recommended schedule. It appears to have been effective. There should have been more to say. Gratitude, emotion, some acknowledgement of the profound debt owed. But Kellerman found himself unable to articulate it. How do you thank someone for your continued existence? How do you express appreciation for 54 years of life that would not have occurred? The magnitude of the debt made words inadequate. Instead, he simply extended his hand. Moyer shook it with the mild grip of an elderly man, and they parted without further conversation. Later, Kellerman would regret not saying more, not expressing what he felt. But in the moment, the handshake seemed sufficient. A simple physical connection between the man who had lived and the man whose work had made that life possible. Moyer died in 1978 at the age of 83. His obituary in the New York Times ran 6 inches, buried on an inside page, noting his contributions to fermentation science and his role in wartime penicillin production. The Associated Press wire service picked up the story, but few newspapers ran it. He was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. A modest family legacy that gave no indication of the thousands of families that existed because of his work. The statistical analysis of penicillin's impact continued for decades after the war. Medical historians refined their estimates, corrected for confounding variables, argued over methodology. The consensus range settled at 100,000 to 200,000 Allied soldiers' lives saved, a figure that accounted only for direct prevention of infection-related deaths, not for the secondary effects of improved survival rates on military effectiveness or morale. But numbers, even numbers in the hundreds of thousands, failed to capture the texture of what was saved. Each of those lives was a singular universe of experience. Memories formed, relationships built, children raised, work accomplished. Kellerman's life was unremarkable by any conventional measure. He never became wealthy, never achieved fame, never did anything that historians would record. He ran a hardware store in a small Pennsylvania town for 40 years. He served on the town council for 2 terms. He coached Little League for 15 seasons. He taught his 4 children to fish, helped them through college, attended their weddings, held his grandchildren. This was the shape of salvation. Not grand, but ordinary. Not heroic, but human. The miracle of penicillin was not that it created extraordinary outcomes, but that it permitted ordinary ones. It allowed men to return to normal lives, to participate in the unglamorous but essential work of building families, communities, and civilizations. Multiply Kellerman's ordinary life by 100,000 or 200,000, and you begin to approach the true scale of what Moyer's work accomplished. Cities' worth of ordinary lives, unremarkable except for the fact that they happened at all. By the time this narrative is being written in 2025, every soldier saved by wartime penicillin is dead. The youngest would be over 100 years old. Their children are elderly. Their grandchildren are approaching retirement. The biological consequences of Moyer's work have cascaded through 3 or 4 generations, expressed in the existence of people who would never have been born if their grandfather or great-grandfather had died from an infected wound in 1944. The pharmacological consequences continue. Modern antibiotics are descendants of those early fermentation techniques. The infrastructure of the pharmaceutical industry, the regulatory frameworks for drug approval, the expectation that bacterial infections can be cured, all trace back to the wartime crash program that transformed penicillin from laboratory curiosity to mass-produced medicine. But we are also living through the long-term consequences of antibiotic overuse. Bacteria have evolved resistance. The miracle drugs are becoming less miraculous. The same pharmaceutical companies that saved millions with antibiotics have largely abandoned antibiotic research because the economic incentives favor chronic disease treatments over acute infection cures. We may be approaching a post-antibiotic era where common infections once again become fatal. This makes Moyer's achievement both more impressive and more poignant. For approximately 80 years, from 1943 to the present, humanity has possessed reliable weapons against bacterial infection. That span, less than a single human lifetime, may represent a unique period in medical history, bracketed on one end by pre-antibiotic vulnerability and potentially on the other by post-antibiotic resistance. If so, then Moyer's generation achieved something that may not be repeatable. They solved a fundamental problem of human existence. For millennia, bacterial infection was among the leading causes of death. For 8 decades, it was largely conquered. If resistance makes antibiotics ineffective, we will need new solutions. Phage therapy, novel antimicrobials, prevention strategies. But we may never again experience the dramatic transition that Moyer's generation witnessed, the sudden shift from helplessness to control. Epilogue. The fermenter's ghost. The Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria still exists, now called the National Center for Agricultural Utilization Research. Some of the original buildings remain, though the interior has been repeatedly renovated. Fermentation research continues, but focused on biofuels and industrial enzymes rather than antibiotics. Pharmaceutical companies long ago moved penicillin production to more cost-effective facilities, often overseas. There is a small plaque in one hallway noting that this facility was the site of the wartime penicillin project. Visitors rarely notice it. The building houses offices, laboratories, conference rooms, the mundane infrastructure of modern research. Nothing in the architecture or atmosphere suggests that this was once the site of one of the most important medical achievements in human history. But Tank 7, the fermentation vessel where Moyer perfected his technique, has been preserved. It sits in a small museum room, restored to approximately its wartime appearance: steel walls, glass observation ports, valves and gauges and temperature monitors. A placard explains its significance, includes a few historical photographs, notes the number of lives saved. The tank is empty now, silent, a relic. But for a brief period in the middle of the 20th century, tanks like this one produced liquid salvation, golden brown broth containing microscopic fungi converting agricultural waste into medicine, churning day and night, monitored by technicians who understood that every batch represented dozens or hundreds of soldiers who might survive wounds that should have killed them. Andrew Jackson Moyer stood before tanks like this, watching the liquid circulate, calculating yields, adjusting parameters, solving problems. He was not a warrior. He never fired a shot in anger, but he fought his own kind of war. A war against infection, against death, against the biological enemies that had killed more soldiers throughout history than all the bullets and bombs combined. He won that war, not completely, not permanently, but decisively enough to matter. For the soldiers who lived because of his work, for the families who were not shattered by loss, for the civilization that preserved itself by preserving its young men, his victory was absolute. The fermenters' war was won in steel tanks filled with corn-steep liquor, fought with agitators and air pumps and carefully selected fungal strains. It was won in the unglamorous infrastructure of industrial microbiology, in the patient accumulation of process improvements, in the relentless optimization of yield and efficiency. It was won by a man whose name most people never knew, whose face appeared in no newspapers, whose grave is visited only by family. But it was won. And because it was won, Tens of thousands of men who should have died instead lived, loved, built, and passed on to their children and grandchildren the gift of existence, a gift made possible by a microbiologist in Peoria who understood that saving the world sometimes requires nothing more dramatic than learning to grow mold efficiently in agricultural waste. The tanks are silent now. The mold no longer grows. The war is long over. But the echo of that achievement reverberates still in every life descended from those who survived, in every antibiotic prescription written, in every patient who walks out of a hospital cured of an infection that would once have been fatal. In the end, Andrew Jackson Moyer saved the world not with weapons, but with waste, not with violence, but with fermentation, not with heroism, but with patient, unglamorous, absolutely essential work that transformed scientific discovery into practical salvation on an industrial scale. The Fermenters' War, the quietest war, the war that saved more lives than any general's campaigns, the war that a microbiologist won in a laboratory in Illinois while the world was burning.